message. So, dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm very happy to welcome you at Deleuze and Guattari conference, and we will start this session, Aesthetics and Time, the first part, uh, according to the program. So, the first who is planned is Daniel Fineman from Occidental College from United States of America, and the the talk is entitled Temporal Anxiety. So the floor is yours, and we'll be listening to you. I would like to ask our colleagues to switch the microphones and the cameras, and then we turn it on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? All right. In Deleuze's work, haexiety is an often used term. As its Latin origin testifies, it seems to designate the thisness of that which is under consideration, those existential differences that purport to allow the disaggregation of things, or, more perfectly in my view, events. In this construal, haexiety may seem relatively unimportant and narrow in scope, as it is read traditionally as only the accidents and inessential markers of individuality. However, the claim of this paper is that the operation of the differentiation at work here is seminal and largely inadequately understood both conceptually and in regard to Deleuze's philosophy. To make my claims a little clearer, I will very briefly review a medieval concept of haexiety and the most common modern understanding. To this obvious context, I will add a bit on shifters, as they form that very special and limited grammatical and existential category of demonstrative pronouns. I will then, with even more ridiculous concision, attempt to indicate how haexiety forms a paradigmatic case for the reconceptualization of the agonized and failed attempts from Kant on to at least the logical foundationalists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries to rationalize the coordination or correlation of sensation and conception. Finally, I will adumbrate how haexiety is understood in Deleuze. His intensive haexiety escapes from dualism's double bind of solipsism or raw sensation, famously articulated in one of the most well-known aphorisms of Kant's first critique. Thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. Deleuze escapes this catch-22 not by just tweaking the tradition of the indexical, but by making the dynamic disparity that haexiety presents punctually as the constituent modality of all virtual events. Duns Scotus, 1266 to 1308, is often credited with the invention of the concept of haexiety. He saw it as a non-qualitative property of an object. As such, he understood the differentiation of an object as intrinsic, that each thing as it has a distinctive and resonant feature what made it singular. Haexieties then seemed to be for him particulars but not essences. His view is closer to that which we will find in Deleuze. I will call these intensive haexieties. The dominant modern tradition is quite different than Duns Scotus. Its genesis is even older, closer to a reading found in Embryo and Aristotle. In this tradition, the one which informs, however tacitly, most science and analytic philosophy is that of essence and accident. A thing is what it is by virtue of its essences, those inherent constitutive properties that make it substantially what it is, and thereby supply its self-identity, even though the particular shares these same constituents equally with every other member of its class of such objects. In this reading, the differences that allow us to discern this particular one as opposed to that one are accidents. Analytics tend to label this a modal distinction. Essences are necessary, but accidents of individuality are contingent. The preference in this reading for the same over differencing makes objects suspiciously available for translation into logical symbolic structures. Perversely, though, this method of distinction makes accidents essential to the identification of the individual at the same time that they are inconsequential to that individual's concept and constitution. Therefore, while the term has sometimes been seen as equivalent to quiddity, whatness, haexiety means almost the opposite. Whatness designates the supposedly constitutive essences of an object that substantiate its ontic participation in a particular kind, members of a supposed set grouped under a common noun and not its accidental differences. Thus, haexiety typically appears not alone as a demonstrative pronoun, but immediately is linked to its kind, not this alone, but this man, this woman, this tree, this apple. Thus, the demonstrative appears to function almost adjectively, a pure deixis without significance or other function. This is, however, not a common noun but a demonstrative pronoun. As such, it is a shifter, one of those fairly rare words, such as here, now, and the personal pronouns, that negotiate the relational functions between the otherwise potentially solipsistic closed structures of natural languages. Shifters are, in fact, the hybrid chimeras of contact between conception and existence. In the theorization of shifters since Jespersen, this linkage of language and object has been understood conceptually as a correspondence activity between a term and its material instance. As in the case of Frege's influential essay on sense and reference, this traditional theorization of the shifter valorizes the abstract Platonic category of the shifter's conceptual side over its existential instantiation, reference. In this reading, the shifter as linguistic norm regulates and nominalizes the phenomenon it supposedly coordinates. In this double binding, haxiety seems to be, in its dominant tradition, a consequence of dualism as it is faced with the problem of individuation among objects that nominally share all their essences, say two coins of the same vintage or two apples from the same tree. This problem has at least three parts. One, the determination of thought itself. Two, the determination of object. And three, the one facet most at issue here, the reliable connection between these two. None of these has, I think, been yet well settled, except insofar as we grant the two foundational and self-serving claims of the analytic tradition. One, that the basics of rational consciousness are apodictically certain, or as in Descartes' version, without doubt. And two, the claim that sense data are intuitively obvious. Both of these circular crutches strike me as insubstantial. Even if one were to uncritically grant these two prestidigitations by which philosophy and science claim that the two traditional sides of dualism, thought and extension or substance, were established, the connection, the problem here, seems even more inscrutable. Even if the concept can allude to an object in some manner, does not that object have potentially an infinite array of qualities? And so, how can a finite concept adequately capture that infinity when definitional elements are necessarily finite? Further, as every object so called changes, how can the concept of one moment be applicable accurately in the next as the object is no longer the same? The supposed solution to these difficulties is in some way hidden in the greater functions of haxiety, the convenient division of object characteristics into essences and accidents. An essence is that which makes an object what it is thought to be, its definitional qualities or attributes. I use this term definitional intentionally because it is by this transitional concept that the adequation of thing and name are made preemptively possible. This is the claim that a name, as some foundationalists assert, is hardwired, as it were, to a definite description. With this presumption of collection of objects of a certain kind, whether a natural or artificial class, is picked out in advance. However, the individuals of this suspiciously formalized set can only be known by their accents, but these are definitionally inessential to the scientific interpolation of the particular instantination, even as they are ineluctably necessary for an existential encounter. Still, this preparatory convenience seems to solve two problems. It allows the reductionism and non-dynamic character of class to function as a sufficient anticipation of the actual particulars, and it allows, at least in the minds of its adherents, for the dismissal of the universal problems of variability in both individual constitution and temporal change as literally inconsequent as far as it allows picking out objects of any sort whatsoever. The valorization of the definitional or rational half of the correlational thought object link is made possible then through the typical construal of the operation of haxiety. As in the verbal accompaniment of individuation, the shifter is just a supposedly neutral arrow or ostentation that eliminates the very pesky differentials that made it possible. The shifter half of an ostensive phrase, say for example, again, this apple, has a kind of immediate obsolescence. The haxiety is seen as content-free and so easily sacrifices its differential functions such that the Platonic essences may be reached through a narrated doppelganger that divorces itself from its weird parent. This is a cheap trick repeated endlessly in the basic literature that founded analytic philosophy, as it tried to connect logic and mathematics, the most deductive and supposedly thought-centered sciences, to the inductive objects that realize those concepts. In other words, haxiety is the central but often unnoticed medium for that primeval concern, reference. The classics of analytic philosophy, in Frege's sense or reference, or Russell's on denoting, or Tarski's concept of truth, share a number of moves that indicate their cheap evasions of the very elemental problems they say they are addressing. These include 1. Using narratives of correlation, pure stories in the natural languages, as if they were innocent representations of truth and fact that could then be later codified without prejudice into the meta languages of symbolic logic. 2. Using the basic model of dualism, thought, and extension as if this image of thought was already granted validity and clearly available instead of being the importation of a structural circularity. Take, for example, this first definition from Tarski. Quote, a true sentence is one which says that the state of affairs is so-and-so and the state of affairs is so-and-so, end quote. 3. Jumping over the very gap which is constitutive of dualism's presumption of discrete thought and objecthood without even a nod to that gap and without explaining how that gap is crossed. This evasion is the very function of hexiety. For instance, Frege's famous example of the morning star and evening star, which narrates, purely nominally, their equivalence and conveniently eradicates the very notion of time as significant even as it is central to the very distinction made. 4. Presuming duration. Kripke's baptism is an attempt to accommodate the problem of time, but does not do so substantially as it offers no mechanism for tracing an entity's existential provenance. Further, the time he characterizes as purely numerical and recognizes no chain in the baptized object. That is fictionalized essentialism again. It presents an object whose duration alters nothing the philosopher cares to count. So essence is once again here conflated with definition. The blind circularity that grows out of the unconscious logocentrism of these figures is that of what Deleuze calls the dogmatic image of thought, the articulation of differencing through the concepts of same and equal. This ubiquitous presumption is odd since sameness ever can occur if we take the reciprocal of Leibniz's law seriously. The indiscernibility of identities, of identicals, mandates the inequality of the non-identical. In Deleuze's model, sameness is only possible in what he calls the actual. This is paradoxically the representation of a world which, in its own chaotic opening and roiling, is inherently unavailable to adequate representation. Forces for Deleuze express their differencing without homology or correspondence, without cease or consolidation. The only certain thing in the world is change. Real time is chaotic in character. Reality, then, is a contiguous and dynamic soup. It changes unpredictably from moment to moment. Large assemblages of forces and their natural instantiations may only have an inertia of coherence or cohesion. However, that duration that is never other than proximate at the macro level for us. Thus, when we label ourselves or things as the same, we are only nominally eliminating those contending differences because they are inconvenient. Stasis and simplification are powerful tools, even though they are always applied mistakenly. The analytic confuses its model for the modeled. Traditional hexiety enacts this substitution by presuming a stable and discrete subject and a stable and discrete object. What happens then is almost instantly a substitution of a symbolic changeling for the dynamic and constantly differential encounter that hexiety supposedly announced. I say supposedly because in philosophy these encounters are only narrated. What we are given is a representation of the world and not the world represented. Even in experimentalism, the desire for reproducibility dictates the purification of phenomena to one variable with synthesized elements that in no way mimic the open theater of the world that is thus kept at bay. Thus, analysis undoes the very differencing that the second law mandates. The definitional elements of the same, sticking with the common nouns for now, are literally made, reproduced to correlate with the synthesized constitutive essences of the thing so named. This artificial enforcement characterizes the traditional analytic encounter between thought and becoming as the opposite of Deleuze. In A Thousand Plateaus, we find this, quote, there is a mode of individuation very different from that of a person, subject, thing, or substance. We reserve the name hexiety for it. A season, a winter, a summer, an hour, a date have a perfect individuality lacking nothing, even though this individuality is different from that of a thing or subject. They are hexieties in the sense that they consist entirely of relations of movement and rest between molecules or particles' capacities to affect and be affected, end quote. This portrait inverts all we have seen before in the most basic manner. One, the emphasis here is on time, chaotic time, what Deleuze calls the ion, which is characterized by unpredictable change rather than metrical regularity of an atomic clock. Everything is not a thing, as it is an emergent expression of the differential forces of its environs, and that multiplicity's power, Spinoza is the obvious reference here, to be affected by those combinatorial but uncoordinated forces. Two, the space represented here, once again, is not metrical or representational, but differential and active, and not passive or indifferent. These two differences of space-time mean that which is not a state of affairs that is amenable to symbolic representation, but a ceaseless process of production and not reproduction. This hexeity is dynamic and differential. Quote, even when times are abstractly equal, the individuation of a life is not the same as the individuation of the subject that leads it or serves its support. It is not the same plane. In the first case, it is the plane of consistency or composition of hexeades, which knows only speeds and affects. In the second case, it is altogether a different plane of forms, substances, and subjects. And it is not the same time, the same temporality. Aeon or ion, the indefinite time of the event, the floating line that knows only speeds and continually divides that which transpires into an already there, that is at the same time not yet there, as simultaneously too late and too early, a something that is both going to happen and just happened, versus chronos, the time of measure that situates things and persons, develops a form and determines a subject, end quote. In Deleuze's reading, then, hexeades are not the accidental and inconsequential indices of self-identical instantiations of taxonomic kinds, but the virtual mechanism of all events themselves, including subjectivity. Quote, we must avoid an oversimplified conciliation, as though there were on the one hand form subjects of the thing or person or type, and on the other hand spatio-temporal coordinates of the hexeity type. For you will yield nothing to hexeades unless you realize that it is what you are, and that you are nothing but that, end quote. So Deleuze not only asserts hexeity as the best name of all virtual production, he denies the minimization and reductionism of the traditional view. Quote, it should not be thought that hexeity consists simply of a decor or backdrop that situates subjects or of appendages that hold things and people to the ground. It is an entire assemblage in its individuated aggregate that is hexeity. This is a massively different definition. In short, hexeity is the degree zero of differencing, that minimum anomaly available to purely rational consciousness that calculates only on the basis of the same and equal. What makes every event is the interference of non-coordinated forces that realize that their disjunctive synthesis in an output that resembles none of the inputs. The differencing flag by hexeity is not the disposable and inconsequent marker of a clear and distinct identity, but the expressive output that is the machinery of everything. Quote, disparity is, in other words, difference or intensity, difference of intensity. It is the sufficient reason of all phenomena, the condition of that which appears, end quote. In Deleuze's reading, then, what is evoked in the notice of hexeity is not metrical sameness or reproductive representational adequacy, but exactly the emergent material and radically temporal instantiation of becoming as difference, without fixed standard. The normative definition then becomes only the straight man in the comedy that is analytic reference. Thus, the typical attempts at regulation of hexeity remain only as a joke. In contrast, temporal hexeity is intensive and non-coordinate. It presents a world that is dynamically indiscrete in total opposition to object-oriented realism. Now the interpolating symbol finds its ground exactly in its inapplicability, its inability to cognize the event it wishes to capture. This constitutive mistake of the traditional model of hexeity then can recognize itself at last as a symptom of the success constituted by its failure. Thank you. I don't know if we go